Tolstoy's most dangerous discovery wasn't about war or revolution. It wasn't about poverty or disease. It was about people who could see the divine light within every human soul, and why this very ability made them the most isolated outcasts in society. Throughout his life, Leo Tolstoy observed a particular type of person. They weren't geniuses or brilliant scholars, but individuals with extraordinary spiritual perception. Tolstoy called them the Enlightened, and he discovered something terrifying about them. In 1910, just months before his death, Tolstoy wrote these lines: "A scholar is someone who knows many things from all kinds of books. An educated person is someone who knows what is currently accepted in society. An enlightened person is someone who knows why they live and what they must do. Don't try to become a scholar or merely educated. Strive to become enlightened." But Tolstoy uncovered a dark truth. These enlightened individuals, those who could perceive life's true meaning, became the loneliest and most isolated people of all. Not because there was something wrong with them, but because they could see what the majority either couldn't or wouldn't see. Unlike Jung, who focused on the ability to read others' psychology, Tolstoy was concerned with something deeper: the capacity to perceive humanity's spiritual essence. He wrote, "The same spirit dwells in all people, and there were special individuals who could sense this with startling clarity. They could distinguish between what Tolstoy called the divine spiritual self and the individual material self, vain, ambitious, and selfish. They recognized that the external world is not as we perceive it, and therefore everything material in this world is insignificant. So, what matters? That which exists everywhere, at all times, and for all people, the divine spark, the spiritual source of our lives. But this is precisely when the trouble begins. Because once you see this truth, once you truly understand that every human being shares the same sacred essence, you can no longer live by society's artificial rules. You cannot accept that some people should be called Sir or Your Grace, while others are looked down upon. You realize there is only one appropriate title for everyone that offends no one. That title is brother, sister. And that's the beginning of isolation. Because once you start living by this truth, you become a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." Through decades of observation and contemplation, Tolstoy realized that not all people with extraordinary spiritual perception were alike. He categorized them into 4 distinct types, each with a different approach to the divine light they perceived. The first type, the humble perceivers. These are people who understand that God's Spirit dwells within them, but feel no pride because of it. Tolstoy wrote, "A good person elevates their divine spiritual self. But if they seek to elevate their individual material self, vain, ambitious, and selfish above all others, then they become repugnant. They deeply understand that a person cannot elevate themselves above others. They cannot do this because what is most precious in a human being is their soul, and no one knows the value of a soul except God. These individuals live in genuine humility. They know that the gate to the temple of truth and happiness is low. Only those who approach it with bowed heads may enter the temple, and blessed are those who enter. There is vast scope and freedom there, and people love one another and help one another and know no sorrow." The second type, the truth seekers. These are people who can see the essence of life, not with the eyes in their head, but with the eyes of their heart. They understand that true knowledge is the understanding that there is a higher spiritual power. Tolstoy observed that they never stop seeking truth, even when it wounds their pride. They can accept truth however hateful it may be to our pride, and justice however disadvantageous it may be to us. These individuals are driven by an unquenchable thirst for truth. They understand that there are no harmless delusions, and certainly no delusions that are venerable or sacred. It may be said boldly, to console those who devote their lives to the noble and difficult struggle against delusions of every kind, That error may do its work in the night, like owls and bats, until the light of truth appears. The third type, the divine unity, perceivers. These people can sense the vibrations of the spiritual world. Some of these vibrations have not yet reached us, but they are moving, like light vibrations from distant stars moving through the universe. They understand profoundly that we appear to be separate beings, but in our inner life, we are closely connected to every living creature. They recognize that family and fatherland are only two circles within the larger circle of humanity. What's special about these individuals is that they can perceive this unity directly, not merely as a philosophical concept. They genuinely feel connected to every living being, and this profoundly influences how they live and treat others. The fourth type, the spiritual revolutionaries. This is the rarest of the four types, and perhaps the most dangerous to the existing social order. They reject all forms of violence and live their lives based on love rather than violence. Tolstoy wrote, "War can only be prevented if people are willing to suffer persecution for not participating in it. This is the only way." These individuals understand that as long as there is violence, there will be war. One cannot defeat violence with more violence, only by non-resistance and non-participation in it. They live by the principle, "You should conduct yourself so that you can say to everyone, 'Behave as I do.'" And this makes them the greatest threat to systems based on power and violence. These spiritual revolutionaries don't just see the truth, they live by it completely. And this is precisely what makes them the most dangerous enemies of every oppressive system, no matter how civilized that system may appear on the surface. Tolstoy discovered that people with extraordinary spiritual perception faced three specific dangers, and the terrifying thing was that these dangers didn't come from within themselves, but from the very society they were trying to serve. The first danger, disrupting pride-based social order. Tolstoy observed that society is maintained by unspoken agreements about who stands above and who stands below. There are titles, some are Sir, others Your Grace, Master, Your Honor. But those with extraordinary spiritual perception understand that there is only one appropriate title for everyone that offends no one. That title is brother, sister. When they live by this understanding, they threaten the entire social structure. They cannot accept, regarding some people as above themselves, others as below themselves. They understand that one need only remember that the same spirit dwells in all people to see how unjust this is. This creates inevitable conflict, because, as Tolstoy wrote, there is nothing more hateful than someone who boasts about their wealth, position, learning, intellect, enlightenment, and goodness. Yet, the entire social system is based on boasting about these very things. When someone refuses to participate in this game, the whole system feels threatened. The second danger, becoming targets of the proud. This is perhaps the most frightening danger Tolstoy discovered. He wrote, "Pride not only protects itself, but also protects all other sins, and it hates humility, so it rejects the cure, conceals, and justifies sin." People with extraordinary spiritual perception become targets of attack not because they do anything wrong, but precisely because they live rightly. Their very presence serves as a constant reminder of what others could become, but are refusing to become. Tolstoy described this process. A person unenlightened by Christianity loves only himself. And loving himself, he wants to become great, but he sees himself as small. He wants to become important, but he sees himself as insignificant. He wants to become good, but he sees himself as evil. And seeing these things, man begins to dislike the truth and invents arguments to prove to himself that he is indeed as he wants to be. And after inventing these arguments, he becomes great, important, and good in his own eyes. When enlightened people appear, they shatter these illusions, and rather than face the truth about themselves, People often choose to attack the bearer of that truth. The third danger: systematic isolation and persecution. Tolstoy realized that people with extraordinary spiritual perception weren't just socially isolated, but could face systematic persecution. He wrote, "Persecution and suffering are necessary conditions for fulfilling Christian law. Persecution is valuable because it reveals whether a person truly lives by faith. But what's more terrifying is spiritual isolation." Tolstoy observed, "A proud person fears all criticism. His fear stems from the instability of his greatness, for it exists only until a small hole is pricked in his bubble. People with extraordinary spiritual perception, by their very presence, represent that small hole. Therefore, they are not just hated, but feared. And the most terrifying thing is the absolute loneliness of understanding that you're living in a world where the majority of people refuse to see the truth." But Tolstoy didn't just identify the problem. He also developed a process for people with extraordinary spiritual perception to live harmoniously with their abilities without being destroyed by them. Stage 1. Recognizing your own pride. This is the first and most crucial step. Tolstoy wrote, "Consciousness of sin is often more beneficial to a person than good deeds. Consciousness of sin makes a person humble, while good deeds often increase pride." He taught that before you can help anyone else see spiritual light, you must confront the darkness within yourself. Nothing is more beneficial for the soul than humiliation received with joy. Like warm rain after the scorching, burning sunshine of self-satisfaction, humiliation received gently refreshes the human soul. The specific technique Tolstoy taught was, "Be severe in judging yourself, and gentle in judging others, and you will have no enemies." This sounds simple, but is extraordinarily difficult. Because humanity's natural tendency is to do the opposite, be gentle with ourselves and harsh with others. Tolstoy emphasized, "To learn humility, try to catch yourself in proud thoughts when alone." He understood that pride often lurks in the darkest corners of consciousness, and only through careful observation can we discover it. Stage 2. Developing true humility. Tolstoy discovered that humility cannot be learned like a skill. He wrote, "Humility cannot be acquired independently. Humility is the result of transferring your desires from the material realm to the spiritual realm." This is one of Tolstoy's most profound insights. He realized that you cannot become humble by trying to be humble. Instead, humility appears naturally when you begin caring about things of real value. The gate to the temple of truth and happiness is low. Only those who approach it with bowed heads may enter the temple, and blessed are those who enter. There is vast scope and freedom there, and people love one another and help one another and know no sorrow. What's important to understand is that bowing your head is not humiliation, but wisdom. You bow your head not because you're inferior, but because you recognize that there are things greater than your small ego. Stage 3. Living for the spirit, not the material self. This is the final and most profound transformational stage. Tolstoy wrote, "My material life must suffer and die, and no effort of mine can deliver me from suffering or death. My spiritual life suffers neither pain nor death. Therefore, salvation from suffering and death lies in one thing only, transferring consciousness of self from the material to the spiritual. This isn't about abandoning the world, but changing your relationship with it. Instead of living to serve the needs of your material self, fame, wealth, power, you live to serve what Tolstoy called the divine principle within you." Tolstoy explained, "I am an instrument that God uses to do work. My virtue is to participate in this work, and I can do this if I keep the instrument given to me, that is, my soul, in perfect condition." This stage requires a fundamental shift in consciousness. You no longer ask, "What can I get from this situation?" but, "What can I contribute to this situation?" You no longer live to be loved and admired, but to serve truth and love. Tolstoy concluded, Do not seek love from others, and do not complain about their lack of love for you. Some people love wrongly, incorrectly. Therefore, try to please God rather than people. This is the ultimate liberation. When you no longer depend on others' approval, you can live by truth without fear. And that's precisely when extraordinary spiritual perception transforms from a curse into a gift, not just for you, but for the entire world. But even when they understand the integration process, people with extraordinary spiritual perception still face traps that can completely destroy their spiritual journey. Tolstoy discovered 3 main traps, and the terrifying thing is that they often appear just when people begin to feel they've succeeded in their spiritual development. The first trap: spiritual pride. This is perhaps the most dangerous trap Tolstoy warned about. He wrote, "Woe to the person if he takes pride in what is merely human in him: intellect, learning, honor, wealth, or good deeds." But even more dangerous is when people take pride in their very spiritual enlightenment. Tolstoy observed, "There is no human excellence, beauty, strength, wealth, honor, learning, enlightenment, even goodness which, if not accompanied by humility, will not degenerate from advantages and good qualities into hateful characteristics." This creates a painful paradox. The very recognition of spiritual light can become the source of pride. People begin to think they're special because they can see what others cannot. They forget that, as Tolstoy wrote, "A good person elevates their divine spiritual self. But if they seek to elevate their individual material self, vain, ambitious, and selfish above all others, then they become repugnant." Tolstoy warned, "Like tall weeds growing in a wheat field that absorb all the moisture and nutrients from the soil, and shade the wheat from the sun's rays, so too does pride monopolize all of a person's strength and prevent them from the light of truth." The second trap: withdrawal from the world. Tolstoy recognized another dangerous tendency. People with extraordinary spiritual perception might use their understanding as a way to escape responsibility to the world. He wrote, "A proud person separates himself from others and thereby deprives himself of life's greatest joy, free and joyful communion with all people." But withdrawal doesn't just stem from pride, it can also arise from disappointment and exhaustion. Tolstoy understood that when you see the truth about the world's condition, when you feel humanity's pain, it can be very tempting to think the solution is to separate yourself from it all. But he warned that this isn't the path to true liberation. Instead, he taught, the busier you are with improving your inner life, the more active you become in social life, helping others. True withdrawal is actually a sign that you haven't fully integrated your spiritual awareness. The third trap: becoming a savior. This is perhaps the most subtle trap Tolstoy discovered. People with extraordinary spiritual perception can fall into the illusion that their mission is to save or enlighten others. Tolstoy warned about this through observing himself. He realized that when he tried to teach others, sometimes he himself became uneducated. He wrote in his confession that he had wanted to teach others while acknowledging that he himself was an immoral man. This trap is particularly dangerous because it seems so noble. People think they're serving the light by trying to bring light to others. But Tolstoy understood that when you become obsessed with changing others, you're actually avoiding the work of changing yourself. He taught that instead of trying to become teachers, enlightened people should always consider themselves students. Never think you're too old to learn, that your soul is already as it should be and cannot be improved further. For a rational person, there is no graduation from school. He is a student until death. But why do people with extraordinary spiritual perception exist at all? Why would nature or God create humans who can see what the majority cannot see? Tolstoy spent much of his later life contemplating this question, and he arrived at a profound and hopeful answer. Tolstoy believed that people with extraordinary spiritual perception serve as consciousness pioneers for all of humanity. He wrote, "Just as each individual person, humanity as a whole must change, moving from lower stages to higher development, continuously growing, whose limit is God." He observed that each state of man is the result of his previous state. Growth is achieved uninterrupted and imperceptibly, like the development of an embryo, so that nothing breaks the chain of successive stages of this uninterrupted growth. In this process of consciousness evolution, people with extraordinary spiritual perception serve as humanity's nerve cells. They sense and process information that the rest of the social body isn't yet ready to receive. Tolstoy studied religious and philosophical history to understand how this consciousness evolution process works. He wrote, "From the time of Moses to the time of Jesus, a vast spiritual and religious development took place in individuals and nations. From the time of Jesus to our age, this progress in individuals and nations has been even more significant." He observed that old illusions have been cast aside and new truths have penetrated humanity's consciousness. No individual can be greater than humanity. If a person goes so far ahead of his kind that they don't understand him, there will come a time when they catch up with him, then surpass him, and go so far as to become incomprehensible to those who still stand where that great person once stood. This means that people with extraordinary spiritual perception today are sensing and understanding truths that the rest of humanity won't be able to receive for another century or two. They aren't outcasts, but people ahead of their time. One of Tolstoy's most profound insights was recognizing that the suffering of people with extraordinary spiritual perception isn't a disaster, but a necessary part of the consciousness evolution process. He wrote, "Suffering stimulates man's spiritual life, and suffering teaches man to maintain a reasonable attitude toward life." But more importantly, he understood that the suffering of enlightened individuals serves as an early warning system for society as a whole. Sensitive individuals feel collective problems first and most strongly. Their individual symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. When these people suffer from injustice, violence, or falsehood in society, it's a sign that the entire society needs to change. Tolstoy believed that consciousness change always begins with individuals and then spreads throughout society. He wrote, "Every religious genius casts a brighter light on religious truths and helps bring people closer together. But this process isn't limited to religious geniuses. Every individual with extraordinary spiritual perception can contribute to this consciousness evolution process, albeit on a smaller scale." Tolstoy described this process. "Christianity's corruption has led us away from realizing the kingdom of heaven, but Christianity's truth is like the flame of a campfire. Stifled for a time by green branches, it gradually dries the wet branches, burns them, and flares up here and there. The true meaning of Christianity has been revealed to everyone, and its influence is stronger than the deceptions that stifled it." At the highest level of development, Tolstoy saw that people with extraordinary spiritual perception no longer feel separated from the world. Instead, they become bridges between consciousness and unconsciousness, between light and darkness, between what is and what is becoming. He wrote, "There is one light of truth, and there are people striving toward it from all sides, from as many sides as there are radii in a circle, that is, in countless different ways. Let us strive with all our might toward the light of truth that unites us all." This means that each person with extraordinary spiritual perception has their own unique radius for approaching truth, and all these paths lead to the same center. Their role isn't to convince others to follow their path, but to live that path so authentically that it becomes a source of light for those ready to see. Tolstoy concluded with a hopeful message. A purer Christianity is slowly but surely replacing what once bore that name. This applies not just to Christianity, but to all forms of genuine spirituality. The light is spreading, and people with extraordinary spiritual perception are the first torchbearers in humanity's long journey. To understand more deeply how extraordinary spiritual perception can either destroy or transform a person, Tolstoy studied specific historical cases, both those who succeeded and those who failed in integrating their abilities. Tolstoy had the opportunity to directly observe religious leaders and university professors, people with deep knowledge and understanding of spirituality, but who completely failed to integrate these insights into their lives. He wrote with bitter irony, "A person lacking humility always condemns others. He sees others' faults, but his own passions and vices grow ever larger." Tolstoy observed that many in the Russian Orthodox Church regard all who do not share their faith as enemies, something completely contrary to the spirit of the gospel. These people possessed all the spiritual knowledge, but they used that knowledge as a weapon to attack anyone who dared question or hold different views. Tolstoy realized that many religious teachers, many spiritual masters, forbid their disciples from questioning their faith. The most terrifying thing about these cases was that they had turned spiritual perception into a tool of pride. Instead of being humble before truth, they became the self-exalted who believed only they had the right to access truth. Tolstoy particularly admired Francis of Assisi as a perfect example of successfully integrating extraordinary spiritual perception. He wrote, "Perfect joy, according to Francis of Assisi, is to endure undeserved reproach, and to endure even physical harm without feeling hatred toward the cause of the reproach and suffering." Francis didn't just have extraordinary spiritual perception. He could sense God's presence in every living being, but he also knew how to live with that perception humbly and in service. Instead of using his ability to separate himself from the world, he used it to connect more deeply with everyone. Most importantly, Francis understood that extraordinary spiritual perception wasn't a title or honor, but a responsibility. He never used his ability to make others feel inferior, but to uplift and heal them. Perhaps the most complex and painful case Tolstoy analyzed was himself. In the brutally honest pages of his confession, he admitted that he had once fallen into the trap of wanting to teach others while acknowledging that he himself was an immoral man. Tolstoy wrote, "His life was long chains of suffering, torment, and anguish, and there were not many truly happy days. He had all the deep spiritual insights, yet still couldn't escape the internal conflicts between the demands of the flesh and the soul." But what made Tolstoy ultimately a successful case was his absolute honesty. He never tried to hide his struggles, and it was precisely this honesty that made his insights valuable. Near the end of his life, Tolstoy achieved a certain peace. He wrote, "Now at the end of life he says that life is a great gift, which shows that his view of life has undergone great changes. He had learned to live with extraordinary spiritual perception without being destroyed by it." Tolstoy drew an important conclusion from studying these cases. The difference between success and failure doesn't lie in having or not having extraordinary spiritual perception, but in one's attitude toward that perception. Those who succeeded understood that spiritual perception is a gift to be shared humbly and lovingly. Those who failed turned it into a weapon of pride and separation. After more than 50 years of observation and contemplation, Tolstoy developed a practical guidance system to help people with extraordinary spiritual perception live harmoniously with their abilities. Tolstoy understood that not everyone is ready or able to understand what people with extraordinary spiritual perception experience. Therefore, the first task is learning to identify those who can become companions on this path. He developed specific criteria for recognizing these people. First are those who have the ability to ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. Tolstoy observed that people who can understand usually share one common trait. They don't fear truth, even if that truth might make them uncomfortable. They understand that a wise person has doubts even in his best moments. Real truth is always accompanied by hesitation. If I cannot doubt, I cannot believe. Second, those who can understand are usually actively engaged in self-development work. They may not have extraordinary spiritual perception, but they have understanding of the spiritual nature of life and are working to develop it. Tolstoy taught that sharing extraordinary spiritual perception must be done very carefully and gradually. He wrote, "Words have great power, but their victory is difficult. However, once you win this victory, it can never be taken away. The first step is beginning with humility," Tolstoy emphasized. "The gate to the temple of truth and happiness is low. Only those who approach it with bowed heads may enter the temple." This means that when you share your insights, you shouldn't present yourself as teaching others, but as if you're sharing an interesting discovery. You must always remember that only humble people can know the truth. The second step is observing their reaction. Tolstoy taught, "Be severe in judging yourself and gentle in judging others, and you will have no enemies." If people become defensive or attacking, that's a sign they're not ready. The third step is sharing from the heart, not the head. Tolstoy understood that spiritual perception cannot be communicated through logical arguments. It can only be shared through authentic presence and love. Tolstoy provided specific principles for people with extraordinary spiritual perception to live harmoniously and effectively. The first principle, daily communion with the world's wisest people. Tolstoy wrote, "I cannot understand how some people can live without communicating with the wisest people who have ever lived on earth. I feel very happy every day because I read this book." He spent more than 15 years compiling A Calendar of Wisdom, a book containing the best insights from all the world's spiritual and philosophical traditions. His purpose was to create a practical spiritual guide on how to live in peace with yourself and how to live a life full of kindness, contentment, and happiness. The second principle, serve, don't dominate. Tolstoy wrote, "I am an instrument that God uses to do work. My virtue is to participate in this work." Instead of trying to change the world through domination or persuasion, become an instrument of service to the light. The third principle, live in the present. Tolstoy understood that time does not exist. There is only one small and infinite present, and only in this present does our life take place. Therefore, a person should concentrate all their spiritual strength only on this present. Tolstoy concluded with a hopeful message about the true mission of people with extraordinary spiritual perception. He wrote, "Tolstoy's original purpose was to convey wisdom to the largest number of people possible, to entertain millions of readers. This goal remains as compelling now as it was then, in this era of increasing spiritual need. People with extraordinary spiritual perception don't exist to become isolated outcasts or proud teachers. They exist to become bridges that make ancient wisdom accessible to modern humanity." Tolstoy believed that this work will serve its readers as a practical spiritual guide on how to live in peace with yourself and how to live a life full of kindness, contentment, and happiness. Ultimately, Tolstoy's most dangerous discovery isn't a curse, but a calling. People with extraordinary spiritual perception are called to become servants of light, not to separate themselves from the world, but to bring light into the world with humility, love, and wisdom.